Ooh, we've got that there.
Yeah, that's fine, Tim. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you, Alistair, for an excellent introduction to the subject. Alistair was a colleague of mine at the Environment Agency many years ago now, so it's nice to see him again in this capacity. I will not say anything about the pros and cons of rewilding as a theoretical or a philosophical thing. I'm ill-equipped, and that's already been done quite nicely for me there. So I will attempt to rush through this with brevity unknown to the unknown to anyone that's actually ever seen me do a talk or actually talk generally. Yeah, now, so thanks to Suffolk naturalists to have invited me, Jen and Martin specifically. Thank you to Dorothy Casey, who I assume is here somewhere watching this, former head of conservation at Suffolk Wildlife Trust, rewilding dynamo in East Anglia, who I've worked with for a few years now on these kind of things, and who is responsible for me coming in and having a look at the Orthoptera, which is the grasshoppers, groundhoppers and bush crickets in this case, of an ex-farm and now a nature reserve, Suffolk Wildlife Trust Nature Reserve, near Bury St Edmunds. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. Now, the site, as Martin has been there, is one that I would very well recommend you having a look at. Black Bourn Valley, 119 hectares, just sort of below 300 acres, owned and managed by Suffolk Wildlife Trust since 1995 in Suffolk. I'm a Norfolk boy, so this is quite nice for me to be working in East Anglia again on these sorts of things. It's got the Black Bourn River, as the name would suggest, along the eastern edge. Typical soils for the sort of area, quite lime rich, loamy. Interesting thing about the site, if you get to go, is the number of ponds that it has. It's got 11 ponds were extant when Suffolk Wildlife Trust acquired the site in '95, and they've got 9 new ponds now, which were created as part of the Freshwater Habitat Trust Million Ponds project. And these are really important habitats to consider in the mosaic of rewilding habitats. Here's a map of Black Bourn Valley Nature Reserve. Yeah, I've got the river along the eastern edge there. Lots of ponds, as you can see, they're fairly big fields. The important thing about this site is, although it's farmland, it's got some important corridor habitats that connect to it. So when the rewilding was initiated, there's quite a lot of routes of colonisation for species onto the sites, either along the river valley with the valley meadows, railway line, and there's a green lane that's running through the site and a bit of woodland as well. So, apologies. So there's quite a lot of routes for things to get on there, for species to get on there. Now, when I wrote the paper for the study that I'm describing, there was a bit of debate among the reviewers about rewilding max and my lack of mentioning of any of this, and the philosophy of what was actually happening. So when we say rewilding max, I'm sure others will talk about that, we're talking about regeneration with an absence of management, such as livestock grazing. Now, Black Bourn is largely unmanaged since it reverted after Suffolk Wildlife Trust got it. So it's more of a rewilding max approach. There have been cattle on two of the fields particularly, but in a very light grazing capacity. So it's not completely rewilded and left to regenerate naturally after arable cropping. So there's 2 classes of fields that we were studying, those where cropping ceased in 2017. So up until the study's point in 2021, that was 4 years. And those where cropping ceased in 2013 or in 2007. So that's 8 years plus. So we've got older fields and younger fields since the site was taken out of farming. What did we do? Very quickly, I've spent far too much, I've spent an enjoyable part of my life studying Orthoptera, which is grasshoppers, crickets, etc. Ideal, 25 years studying them. I absolutely love these guys. Ideal for studying the effects of rewilding, quite easy to monitor, quite well-established transect methods used to count them. And we did an acoustic sampling method where we'd hear the stridulations or songs of the males to record species, but also we'd record what we saw along these transects. So we had a dual method to record the abundance and relative abundance of these species between the fields. They're quite quick to respond to things. There's quite a few climate spreaders in there, your rosells, bush crickets, your long-winged coneheads, which will probably colonise sites which have been left to regenerate to grassland and scrub quite quickly. A lot of species with different habitat requirements, nothing rare in this group in this area, but as we'll see, there's some interesting responses that I wasn't expecting, to be brutally honest. We've got bare earth, short, tall grass species and scrub. So we did various bits of monitoring. We also monitored some sward heights and quadrats, plant cover, etc., mammal presence as well. What did we find in a very brief way to summarize results of what we've published? In the 4-year-old fields, quite low diversity, basically. Soft brome was one of the more abundant species in those fields, quite weedy, as you'd expect so soon after arable cropping sees quite a lot of leaf litter. But when you got to the 8-year-old field, you had significant, and I mean statistically significant, higher abundances of fescues and bents, so these fine leaf grasses. And the 2 species below that, the field and the meadow grasshopper, which were significantly more higher statistically in the 8-year-old fields and the 4-year-old fields, love fescue and bent habitats. So you've got this quite quick maturity towards more of a fescue and benty open sward, maybe with a bit more clover and stuff for pollinators as well. A lot of groundhoppers on this site. I don't know how many people have seen groundhoppers, but these are like small grasshoppers basically that don't sing, there's no stridulation. The common and the slender groundhopper are not species I've seen much in Essex, particularly on farmland. So to have those 2 species in the higher abundances in these 8-year-old fields was actually quite surprising. In fact, to see them at all. But that may come back to sort of pond edge and anthill habitats, which I'll come on to in a second. Species and richness and diversity, so the number of species and the diversity of the species, how even they were in their abundances, that was higher on these 8-year-old fields as well. More anthills. Again, I was, not totally surprised, but anthills were more abundant in the older fields. These were black ants. A lot more Lagomorphs dropping, so this is hares, rabbits, etc. Again, something which is probably no surprise to many people, but there's a lot more grazing activity in some of the areas in these 8-year-old fields. More deer paths as well. So you have, I think we recorded footprints and drop-ins about 4 different species of deer, mainly roe deer, that we came across. The grasshopper in the middle was the one that really surprised me. That's the common green grasshopper, Homocestus ridiculus, which on farmland, you don't see it much at all. It's traditionally an unimproved grassland species, probably because it's got a slow rate of colonization of new habitats. And you just don't see it that much on farmland. But to get it in the 4-year-old fields and the 8-year-old fields in relatively even abundance suggests that it was in the area, probably used the corridor to get onto the site, and has very, very quickly moved throughout the different habitats. That was quite surprising, and probably one of the more interesting results of the study, I think. These 8-year-old fields also had a lot of value for pollinators. Dorothy and me and Anna Saltmarsh and various others that accompanied us looked at bees as well on clovers and things. Nothing rare, but quite a good diversity of species and abundance. The anthills were quite numerous, particularly in the 8-year-old fields. Quite big, some of them as well. And those are really, really good microhabitats for a range of invertebrates. But in the case of grasshoppers, good basking sites, good egg-laying sites for females. We often, I think at the start of the study, when we did a survey in May or June, we saw quite a lot of nymphs that had hatched out of the eggs on these anthills. So really, really important finding there, I think. And I think it's Tim King, who's done a lot of research on anthills, mainly the yellow meadow ant, Lasius flavus, is quite interested in that result as well, that aspect of rewilding. Pond edge habitat, as always mentioned, don't forget pond creation, various things like that. Very good for groundhoppers. They need that very broken ground as camouflage, etc. That's a common groundhopper. I think that might be Dorothy's jumper or something. I'm not entirely sure, but it probably is. It was a good contrast for the photo. Grasshoppers, again, the ones that like that bare ground habitat, the field grasshopper, very abundant in that kind of broken habitat, really important edge habitat. Mentioned deer, lots of lay down areas, paths, mammal paths through tall grassland, quite important break in the vegetation structure, particularly important for grasshoppers, etc. as well. Not the strongest correlation between abundance of grasshoppers and deer areas or lay down areas, etc. But still an interesting, I suppose you say, natural grazing impact into fields that didn't have any grazing at all. So it's not to overlook the presence of this more unplanned grazing, really. Now, to come on to, I should have said actually the pond edge habitats also had a hell of a lot of rabbit grazing around it, which again keeps that, and poaching from deer, which creates that that bare ground habitat that we really need for a lot of invertebrates, not just grasshoppers and stuff that's much, much rarer than what I'm talking about here. You know, the common green grasshopper, the groundhoppers are localized in parts of Suffolk, but, you know, we wouldn't class them as rare, but there's a lot of other stuff that will benefit from that. Looking at corridor habitats, where did the species come from? This is a very important part of any rewilding scheme, particularly on farmland, because, you know, you want to rewild a site near a place, you know, places where you've got routes of getting onto the site for species like rivers, river valleys, railway lines, even road verges, really, if they're particularly good, green lanes, etc. So I suspect a lot of the common green grasshoppers came out of those valley meadows into those fields there, and then spread throughout the site because it was very easy to do, I guess. And you probably had some individuals coming off the railway line. So to summarize very, very quickly, what do we learn from this site? Rewilding, or wilding, as it's sometimes known, can produce swards after arable farming if left to naturally regenerate, that are colonized pretty quickly by a range of fairly common species, but some localized ones as well, even within 4 to 8 years, which is not something I was expecting. I was just expecting long-winged coneheads, rosells, bush cricket, the usual stuff that's spreading due to climate change, but actually the more localized stuff, the groundhoppers and the common green grasshopper, that I was really interested in. Restored ponds, newly created ponds, that edge habitat, very important. Obviously, the pond is important in itself, and the ponds on this site are very good. I think some of them have, but this is tassel stonewort, I believe, are quite a rare plant. So there's a whole range of benefits to having a mosaic approach of habitats on a site. Anthill's very good, as previously discussed, basking, oviposition, egg laying, etc. for grasshoppers. Lagomorph grazing, rabbit grazing, or hare grazing in the wider fields can create these really interesting microhabitats, which are quite important sources of bare earth, which is good again for egg laying and basking, etc. invertebrates. Sponse is species specific, as you would imagine. The best way to get the highest number of species on a site is to have the greatest heterogeneity of microhabitat, which is what is stated in so many studies out there. And to realise that the big issue would be, for me, when you graze and when you don't graze. And I think that's something we could probably argue about at a late stage today, about how much grazing do you have on a site, actual introduced cattle grazing or something. I keep it very light, I think. If it's very light, etc., and I think this site is still being grazed a bit as well. So very light grazing can create those swards. And how much do you then say, well, actually, we'll just leave it to do its own thing and see what happens, which is very interesting. And that's what this study represents. Very quickly, round up, Suffolk Wildlife Trust were given permission to survey the fields. I'm thankful for that. Obviously, Suffolk Naturalists grant funded this through the Morley Grant Scheme, invited me to talk. Professor Rob Fuller was very helpful with reviewing the studies for publication, and the Saltmarsh helped me and Dorothy with the plant surveys, or predominantly Dorothy, I think, and Joanna Hodson, a friend of mine. And it was all summarised in a paper in the Journal of Orthoptera Research last year, and in British Wildlife. If you want any further information, that's me done. Hopefully that's I've not taken too much time up there. Thank you.
Cameron Goodhead, hi Tim. Do you have any comparisons of Orthoptera diversity in the rewilding sites to more traditionally managed species-rich meadows?
Very good question, yeah. Firstly, I'd say what surprised me about Black Bourn Valley was the high number of species, because the 2 groundhopper species and the common green, you don't get on most arable sites. If you were talking about you also had the common green grasshopper, which again is something I would associate with unimproved hay meadows, grazing meadows, etc., not necessarily an arable site that's rewilding. So that was quite a surprise. I think the numbers of grasshoppers are not as high as you'd expect, because the site hasn't been in existence at Lyme. I mean, a good grasshopper site down here would have 3 per metre square, which is just, if you walk through it, it's just that if you see them pinging everywhere, that's going to be over 3 per metre square if you did a quadrat. So that's what you're looking for. There were parts of these sites where you had the lower sward height in the broken ground where you could get something approaching that. But as a, you know, the taller bits, obviously, you know, your grasshopper abundance dropped off, as it tends to do in taller vegetation. You had more bush crickets. But the abundance of species, you know, the abundance of bush crickets and grasshoppers and groundhoppers on this site was what I would suggest for this area quite surprising. If you go to Breckland, for instance, you'll get something similar. Places like Santon Downham, etc. Some of the dry heath there, you might get similar, where you get higher abundance. But they're probably the only real places where I've seen it in that, you know, in Suffolk, to be honest. Some of the sea walls can be quite good as well. So it's not replicating it, but it's that species, the common green, that's the indicator. Maybe it's not as much of an indicator of unimproved grassland as we think. Maybe when it can get there, you know, it just gets there. It's just, it's isolated in certain, you know, in an arable land and a lot of places it is there, and it can't get anywhere. So when you rewild, you've given it we've given it no excuse for not actually spreading. That's what surprised me the most about this study, because I've said it, others have said it, orthopterists. It was a surprise, and you think, that's great. You know, we learn all the time, don't we? Even that species will use these sites after relatively few years, which is brilliant. You know.